This is Mike Cottmeyer's talk, Why Agile Transformation Fails, from the TriAgile 2021 conference.
Awesome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Okay, cool. So this is a talk that we are in the process of evolving. It's really based upon a lot of fundamental thinking we've been doing for the last 10 years at Leading Agile around Agile and Agile transformation. And so just a brief bit of history on me. So I started off like my career in Agile working for a company called CheckFree, doing large financial systems. Never really had the advantage of doing Agile in the small, right? So everything that I ever did was really Agile in the large. And we were trying to figure out how to do Agile with like mainframes and distributed systems and databases and all kinds of like really complex stuff. And so I really cut my teeth on this idea of large scale Agile. And we were inventing some things with Agile program and portfolio governance before those things were really things in the industry, before SAFe, before LESS, before any of that kind of stuff. And so I got the benefit about 12 years ago of working for version 1. And I don't even know if they call themselves version 1 anymore, version 1 CloudNet, what have you. But anyway, so I got to get into a lot of different companies over a couple year period and really get to see what some of the failure modes were associated with doing Agile. Fast forward a couple years, started Leading Agile. We're almost 11 years old now, and we're about 150 people based in Atlanta, Georgia. And what's really cool about the last 10 years is that we've gotten the opportunity to work with a few teams and really large companies. We've got the opportunity to work with entire small companies. And then as we've progressed, we've gotten to work with entire large companies. And so we're involved in some, Agile transformations right now that are in excess of 12,000 people just on the IT side, and really starting to even fan out into the business. And so this experience that I'm going to talk about and some of the insights that I'm going to share with you really quickly, because this is going to be a fast talk, are based upon some really, really tough learned lessons. And for me personally, and I'll just be super transparent, the lessons that we've learned are not just on the delivery side, right? Which that's super important and super interesting, but it's also on the sales side, right? Dan Pink wrote a book, I think it's called To Sell is Human or something like that. And at the end of the day, I actually have to go out and actually sell, right? Because we're trying to get clients and do different things and trying to convince clients to keep us around and all those kinds of things. But you guys are trying to sell these ideas internally into your companies too. So to some degree, we're all kind of salespeople. And so the lessons that I'm going to talk about here really come from not only doing transformation work, but also like getting people convinced to do transformation work, right? And getting people to understand what the extent of the challenge is. And so one of the things that I kind of want to start off with, let me see if I can work my tech here. One of the things I want to talk about is when you're dealing with large scale Agile transformation. And I'm not talking about like how you do Agile on a project or how you do Agile on a single team or even in like a safe work group kind of a thing. What I'm really talking about is when you go into, I know, TriAgile, we got a lot of banks in the North Carolina area. When you go into banks, right, it's like there has to be a way of thinking about this that executives care about. And so regardless of what we value at the team level or the execution level, regardless of what we value about culture, about respecting people, really solid team level Agile practices or work group practices or technical practices or whatever it is, the one thing that I've learned super the hard way over the last 11 years is that you have to speak in a way that the executives care about. And so I'm going to hit really at a high level, like what they care about. And what that is basically you have to anchor your transformation to something that the executives care about, right? You have to anchor it. So a lot of the talks that I do, if you guys have listened to my, any of my Agile transformation talks or my executive guide talks or whatever, one of the things that I talk about all the time are things like predictability, quality, early return on investment, cost savings, innovation, product fit. But what we're really starting to understand, it's even starting to go beyond that, are things like, maximizing stakeholder value, shareholder value. How are we dealing with compliance issues? Like, how are we dealing with strategic alignment, right? How is the organization helping us realize our strategy and market? Not at the product level per se, but at the organizational level, right? How are we deploying dollars and people into solving some of these really, really complex problems? And I think that a lot of us have this intuitive sense that if we do Agile, that those things will be solved. But one of the things that we've learned is that in the transformation process, you have to very directly and explicitly connect to that value. And so, as you might imagine, there's 1,000 different ways you can do that. So it's not like I can put up a slide of like tips and tricks for how to connect to executive enterprise value. But as you guys are doing this, you have to. And the reason why is because when you start to talk about change at that level, it's incredibly risky. And a lot of times it can be really expensive, whether you're using external consultants or you're hiring teams internally or you're paying for certification or what have you, right? There's a big expense and there's a lot of risk. And so in order to get executives to pay attention to that, you have to connect to the things that they care about. So that's the first point that I want to make. The next point that I want to make is you have to be able to demonstrate measurable progress. So, a lot of times, especially in the early days, it would be like, well, how many teams do we have trained? Or how many Scrum Masters, or how many teams have Scrum Masters, or how many teams are doing daily stand-ups or what have you? So one of the things I think is interesting is I think a lot of times those can be vanity metrics. And so what we have to do is we have to figure out how to connect our activities, the things that we're doing, whether it be training people or coaching people or whatever, to actual measurable progress within the organization. And so we invented this thing we call outcomes-based planning. And there's so many topics in here that are like talks in and of themselves, right? But it's like we're going to take a group within the organization and we're going to get it to a known state, maybe something like predictability or able to release product early or the ability to operate as autonomous teams, something like that. And we're going to create a plan for what does the first 2 weeks look like? What does the next 2 weeks look like? What do the 2 weeks after that look like, right? It's kind of a hypothesis on how this should play out. And what we found is that if you can, to kind of use a metaphor out of like shooting pool, if you can figure out how to call your shots, right? 8 ball in the corner pocket and say, this is what's going to happen. This is the backlog of stuff that we need to do. And these are the outcomes you're going to get. Here's the value that you're going to get from them. And you can start to measure, in effect, velocity against that and start to demonstrate organizational improvements based upon these changes you're making and connect it to the value prop that they care about, right? Then what that does is that keeps the interests of the executives going much longer than otherwise might be possible, okay? Third piece is measurable results, right? So we can tell a really good story around the value that we're trying to give to the executives. And we can create this hypothesis around how this transformation should execute. But what we also have to be able to do is we have to be able to demonstrate intermediate progress. So it's almost like the idea of leading indicators and lagging indicators. So we have this hypothesis on how the transformation is going to play out, but we need to understand leading indicators of what are the performance improvements that we expect within this group so that the executives are reasonably assured that they're going to get the value out of the transformation that we expect. And I think one of the mental barriers that we have as a transformation, community, an Agile transformation community, is that, we often say, well, Agile is like we don't plan, things emerge and, we have to do a little bit and we have to figure it out. We're going to do it incrementally and iteratively. And all of that stuff is true, right? Because even, as many of these as we've done and as many of these scripts as we've put together, they're all just a baseline at the end of the day. And things are going to change and you're going to hit reality and all these kinds of things. But what I've found is that if we can't connect the things we're doing to the leading indicators, that like demonstrate value, that we're moving towards the lagging indicators, really, really difficult to keep the executive's attention throughout this, right? It's very difficult to keep the interest of the organization as we move along. So let's talk a little bit about business agility and why business agility fails. Here's kind of interesting thing. So like every talk that I ever give really comes out of, some visceral experience that I had. And this particular sequence, it got me thinking a couple years ago. We were doing some pre-sales work with a client, and I started talking about Scrum and Safe. And it was really interesting. And the lady cuts me off and she goes, Scrum and Safe, that's what the teams do. She goes, I'm not talking about team level agile, I'm talking about business agility. And it was really, really fascinating to me, right? And I had this aha moment because the people that are interested in business agility, like we viscerally understand that at the team level, you have to have complete well-formed teams operating off of clear backlogs, able to produce working tested software. And at the foundation, it's fundamentally Scrum and XP. And then as you start rolling into work groups, right, then it's, maybe teams doing Safe, organized around value streams or release trains or what have you. But even at that level, the language that we're using is very team and delivery focused. And what's starting to happen is that organizations want to have these broader conversations around strategic alignment, and they want to have these things around compliance and how they're actually going to satisfy their shareholders and all these different things, right? So how are we going to do that with agility, right? That is the problem, right? That's the thing that everybody wants to connect to at this point. So what we're hypothesizing and in the process of validating in market right now is that if you want to do this business agility thing in a sustainable way, developing an agile business model or a system of delivery is only part of the problem. Like what we have to do is we have to figure out how to get there reliably and safely in a predictable manner. And this is the interesting thing, is we have to have the ability to adapt the model and change the model over time. So there's three systems that I'm going to hit here that I think are going to be relevant. And if you guys don't like my words, right, that's cool. If you don't like how I'm laying this out, that's fine. But I think there's some truth in here that I want you guys to hunt and to think about as you start to go into your transformation work in your organizations, and see if like you can't distill the truth out of my talk and apply it into your world, right? So let's talk about the first concept that we've got here, this idea of a system of delivery. So if you look at Scrum, right? So a lot of my talks go into this idea of teams, backlogs, working tested software, structure, governance, and metrics, reference architecture versus reference implementations, like all of this stuff about how agile teams work, the ceremonies they perform, the way they do their jobs, the way they collaborate, the way they produce value, all those kinds of things are loosely what we call a system of delivery. And so if you think about, right, this is the 20th year anniversary of the signing the manifesto. When the Agile Manifesto was signed, the only thing that existed was team level agility. And the only thing that we were talking about is like, how do we get this specific project on the rails, right? Because we knew waterfall wasn't doing it. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to rescue troubled waterfall projects or troubled unplanned projects. And we wanted to do it at the team level. And so everything that we learned around Scrum, XP, early Pop and Dick work, right? Early Highsmith work, all that kind of stuff was really in the team level space. And it was all around system of delivery. Okay. Didn't really tell us how we were going to get there, how we were going to form those teams or where those backlogs were going to come from. We kind of had the idea, we knew what a team looked like, and we knew there's this person who was a customer or product owner or what have you. And we knew that this team needed the ability to produce something testable at the end of the sprint. Okay. Problem being is that as Agile started going into more complex ecosystems where there's lots of dependencies and matrixed organizations and project-driven work and all those kinds of things, the conditions to do team level Agile were often not present. So what we did is we kind of doubled down on practices of Scrum and practices of XP, but didn't fundamentally attend to the ecosystem that those practices were designed to operate in. So if you just had 8 people in your garage, you were golden. If you were a 15-person company, no problem. If you were a project team, that was operating independently of everybody else in the organization, you were good. Now you're one team that's basically working on a banking platform and there's 1,000 other people and tons of stakeholders. Like, what do? Right? Because you end up doing a lot of really good Agile stuff, but you don't end up connecting to the executive value prop on that level. Okay. And so that's the problem. And people are starting to recognize this. So we've come in and we've trained people on how to do team level Agile without paying attention to how the ecosystem of the larger enterprise was going to receive those methods that we put in. Okay. So along comes SAFe, right? Along comes SAFe and LESS and all these different kinds of things. And what I think that those methodologies are largely trying to do was really encapsulate and put structure around larger value streams. Okay. And this is what was interesting about it is you could kind of pull off some team level agility, right? If you had the right conditions in the ecosystem. I think the reason why SAFe takes a certain amount of heat is because it's not really imposing any constraints on what the organization looks like either. And so what it's kind of doing is in the big picture thing and the way that it's managing dependencies and big room planning, it's basically saying, okay, here's 10 or 12 teams. We know they kind of share a deliverable. So let's figure out how to get them in the room quarterly or every 12 weeks or something. I guess that's probably the same thing, every 6 weeks, every 12 weeks. And let's get them to plan together. Okay, cool, right? But a lot of the things that plagued team level agility are plaguing SAFe in some of these larger organizations. Because at the end of the day, Agile, whether it be at the team level or whether it be at the enterprise level, really relies on this idea of encapsulation, right? Dependencies at the end of the day kill agility. So if you have teams with dependencies between them, SAFe can give you a construct and a management framework for dealing with dependencies within a value stream. But what if your value streams have dependencies between them, right? It's like on what level do you know enough about the situation so that you can plan all these dependencies across value streams? At the end of the day, this is the conclusion. This is what I bet. This is what I bet on when I formed Leading Agile 11 years ago, was that if we could figure out how to form encapsulated teams, teams that don't have dependencies between them, we could get those teams really tight backlogs, break the technical dependencies and the technical constraints that prevent us from actually delivering software every couple of weeks, right? So that becomes the foundation of the organization. And then by extension, the larger constructs, the value streams or the work groups or whatever, because the teams are broken up the right way, we can have a shot at trying to break up the work groups in that way. Right. So if you hit our website or you listen to any of my earlier talks, I talk a lot about this idea that we've come to call a system of transformation. So you're asking yourself questions like, how am I going to create the conditions so that either team level Agile or enterprise level Agile will actually work? And here's the interesting thing, right? This is kind of the interesting insight to me. Any of you guys that are doing Agile in these organizations, or you're a change agent with your organization, the ability to teach Scrum or to teach SAFe is rapidly becoming commoditized. The knowledge of what 3 questions to ask in a daily stand-up meeting or how to facilitate a retrospective, again, tons of skill associated with that, but it's not a black art anymore, right? People understand it. The challenge is right, think it at the team level. If you're a Scrum master and your job is to remove impediments for the team, but those impediments are a gigantic mainframe, tightly coupled, written in COBOL, and you know viscerally that it's all the dependencies that are getting in the way, but you can't actually create the conditions where that team can operate autonomously, right? You're going to be trapped in a team that's really trying to do Scrum and can't. Same thing with a safe implementation. So it's like people can come in and train you on what to do all day long, but if you're not empowered to actually remove the impediments to agility, and you don't actually have a funded plan for how to do that, you're going to be going through a lot of the motions of doing agile stuff. And you might even get some benefit from it, because anytime people are in a room talking, it's going to be better. But it's going to fall short of what is possible, and it's going to fail to connect to the larger enterprise problem. Okay, so getting back to our theme here, why do agile transformations fail? I think it's because we largely neglect or fail to get the right permissions, dollars, agency to actually make the fundamental structural and governance changes that are necessary for the practices of agile to actually be effective and for that culture to actually emerge. So what we've spent a lot of time on as a company over the last couple of years in particular is getting really specific about what is the transformation process. This is another place where I think as Agilists sometimes we get hung up. We know what it looks like when it's done right. What's really hard to let go of is like, what are the intermediate steps necessary to get there? And so like I use a metaphor of like, if you were carving, again, I'm not any kind of sculptor or anything, but if you were carving a sculpture, I imagine, you start with like a block of marble and then you shape it, right? And then you continuously refine it. And then you take a piece of it and you make it actually look like a human head or a hand or whatever. And then you polish it and you make it look good, right? So the idea behind transformation is that it's very incremental and iterative. It's very often not everybody at once. So you have to figure out what are the right slices of the organization. And then as you start to think about minimally viable products as it relates to change, what is the minimally viable performance characteristic of a transformed organization? What is the next increment or iteration of that increment? Right? So how would a transformation evolve? What are the series of transformations that have to happen such that we are, in effect, a potentially shippable organization all the time, right? We're constantly adding value into the organization as we transform it, right? Is it performing, right? Are the leading indicators tying to the lagging indicators like we talked about earlier, right? All of that stuff is possible, but we have to think about it differently. It's not just about teaching people Scrum, and it's not just about teaching people SAFe. The system of transformation is how do we systematically remove the impediments to being able to do Agile effectively? Okay, and that is the core problem that we are personally trying to solve. And the reason why I pointed out to you guys is because in your transformations, I think it's super important that you guys recognize the need for this too. But we're still short, right? We still don't have the answer, because this is the hard part. And, again, I'm in a lot of pre-sales conversations. I'm in a lot of very senior executive conversations in our clients. And it's almost like what you have to ask people to do is you almost have to ask them to like suspend disbelief. Because if you're trying to solve a business-focused agility, like really focused on business agility, we know that the underpinnings of business agility are team level agility and enterprise agility. Because without that, then the rest, the ability of the organization to expect and adapt and pivot and do the things that it needs to do more globally are never going to work. The problem is, though, is that we've been messing around with Agile for 20 years, right? Really more than that, probably 30, 35 years, as it just got formalized 20 years ago. And we've made a lot of promises to the industry that haven't panned out for a lot of companies. It's panned out for some, but it hasn't panned out. So there's a lot of people at this point that are really just like over the team level agility thing. And it's really unfortunate because team level agility is an absolutely necessary underpinning of any kind of enterprise level agility or business agility. But we can't hardly talk about it sometimes because people are, they're jaded, right? That's the only way I can say it. And so we have to also recognize that, right? Starting at the team level is often insufficient. And so what the words that we're starting to hear in market, Gartner is starting to talk about these things, executives are starting to talk about these things. The two that really like for a minute, it was business agility and digital transformation. And I know digital transformation is something different, but a lot of times there's significant overlap in what an organization needs to do. Some of the latest buzzwords that are coming out are like PDO, the product-driven organization, right? Agile is by definition a product-driven organization. But people are rebranding business agility as PDO because we're wearing them out on the Agile stuff, right? So product-driven organization is words that are being used. That's really more of a structural entity. Another word that's being used, another set of words that are being used quite a bit is the idea of projects to products. Right? So people are starting to catch on and starting to realize that project-based funding is part of the problem. And so what we really need is product-based funding for a product-driven organization. Well, that's just Agile at scale, right? It is, but again, the words are starting to change. And so if I want to change how I am structuring my enterprise to be a PDO, and I want to change my funding mechanisms, right, to do this P2P thing, right? Then what I have to do is I have to have an enterprise agile capability, and I have to have a team capability, right? So it's like Agile teams all the way down the stack at the end of the day, right? And so talking about this is kind of a funny dance. And so one of the things that we've been trying to hypothesize around is, what does business agility look like structurally, and how do you get there? So what we're finding in practice is that there's certain constraints within the system, right? Again, how you fund projects, how you strategically align to outcomes, how you maximize stakeholder value, how you do compliance. It's like you can't flip those in these really large companies until enough of the organization itself can actually operate within this model. So it's like if you think about like creating a change roadmap, those first three circles that I walked through, they become the underpinning. And then as you get to critical mass within the organization, where there's more Agile teams and enterprise-focused Agile work groups, then you can go into the business and you can say, okay, let's talk about how we're going to change funding. Let's talk about how we're going to change how we govern. Let's talk about how we're going to do compliance issues. Let's talk about how we're going to do strategic enterprise architecture, right? Things like that. Okay, let's talk about how to lead this organization differently. Let's talk about how to manage talent differently. Let's talk about, just anything at that very senior level. So it's like, again, the three circles in the core of this triangle are super important, but they're only a means to the end at the end of the day. Because until we flip to a PDO being the way that we actually do this, and P2P product-based funding being the way that we govern, and we start to change our compliance mechanisms to reflect this new way of working, we're going to be operating in an imperfect system. So just imagine, right? We have to change enough of the organization and get it performant. It can take years. So therefore, before we can actually shift some of the things that we know are going to be on our way. Okay, good. So basically then, so now we know that we need a system of transformation to get the delivery part of the organization installed. Now we're looking at, okay, what does business transformation look like, right? How do you script out? How do you make it predictable so that the business knows, hey, we're going to be in this in-between state for a minute, maybe a year or two, right? Or three. We're going to be in this in-between state. But then once these things hit critical mass, this is how we start to introduce change into our strategic planning. into our funding processes, into in terms of our audit and compliance, right? All those kinds of things, right? So it's a super fascinating conversation. But here's the reality, right? I know a lot of you guys are working in really big companies. It's like, if our aspiration is team level agile or work group level agile, go for it all day long. Do whatever you guys are trying to do. But if we're really talking about business agility, enterprise-wide, corporate-wide business agility, these are the kinds of things we have to take into consideration. And I think the last bit is super fascinating. And the pandemic absolutely highlighted this for a lot of our clients. We were doing some things in pharmaceutical industry. We're doing some things in automotive industry. So think about the defense industry. Think about some of these manufacturing organizations that had to pivot from, let's say, making a car or an airplane to making a ventilator, or people that were using, maybe some techniques to build molecules, right? And to do science around different medications. And they all of a sudden have to pivot, and they have to go and they have to start making vaccines, right? This was like a real thing with a lot of our clients. And so what's interesting is, once you've changed how teams are structured, how work groups are structured, you start to think about how you break dependencies. You start to think about how you're changing your governance, your compliance, your funding, right? All those things. Now what we have the opportunity is we have the ability to pivot. So now the challenge to true business agility becomes, it's like how do we evaluate the emerging backlog of the entire company and redeploy teams of people, redeploy business units to be able to pivot into new markets when things really change? Because make no mistake, this is what the executives want. And they're humoring us with the agile stuff, right? They're kind of skeptical, thinking, okay, you guys are going to do this and that's going to add some value. But what they really want is the ability to dynamically deploy large groups of teams with dedicated funding to brand new classes of problems as these brand new classes of problems emerge. So I think a lot of us that are operating in maybe the low to middle level, we have to look up and we have to kind of see what is going to be required for the entire business to pivot into entirely new lines, right? Maybe go from making software to making, I don't know, whatever, right? Or making one physical device to making a different physical device. These are not incremental changes to existing products. They are total sea changes and pointing the organization at different markets. Okay, so herein lies the breadth of the problem. So we started off with, we have to align to what the executives care about. We have to have a plan for how we're going to change, and we have to be able to measure progress in a meaningful way. We have to get out of the business of talking about team level agility and even enterprise agility, and really start to deeply connect to, what does business agility look like? What does business transformation look like? And the ability to sequence those things to where it's not a black art, right? Where people know what's coming, they can make investments, they can start to see the progress that those investments are making, and then ultimately have this ability to pivot and market on the backside. Okay, so again, hopefully this is a framework for you guys to have a conversation within your companies to make sure that you're appropriately dealing with the breadth of the problem. Now, very tactically, one of the things that we've been playing with quite a bit is the idea of anchoring like an Agile Transformation office and making it the steward of this system of transformation. And so this is some relatively new language that I'm going to explore with you guys a little bit. So we have the system of transformation. We have this thing we call an ATO that is running the system of transformation. And what the system of transformation, or this ATO, basically does is that it acts on the delivery organization to run it through these incremental states. So almost think like a PMO relative to a project office, right? The system of transformation, or the ATO, is kind of that analog acting on and running the change management within the system of delivery. So you have this system of transformation that begets a system of delivery and starts to build a system of continuous improvement. So it's interesting, right? So a lot of the things that, like how we handle change management, how we handle business architecture, how we handle strategic realignment, how we handle compliance, different things like that, how we handle training, coaching services, tooling, metrics, assessments, all those kinds of things. Those things get built in this system of continuous improvement. It's like a platform kind of service. And then we have the transformation office acting on the system of delivery, right? So the system of transformation is kind of the core, making the changes in the system of delivery and then building the capacity to be able to monitor and control and pivot and adapt that organization as things change, right? So part of what we're working on is scripting all of this out in a way that like people can understand it and do it and deliver it and pay for it and all those kinds of things, right? So it's a non-trivial problem, but it is the problem. Like, again, we're figuring out how to do it. The class of problem, though, is absolutely, I'm 100% sure that this is the problem. I suspect there will emerge a lot of different ways to do this. But one of the things that's interesting, this is the last point I'll make, is that a lot of companies are going through transformation fatigue at this point, and they've been transforming for a long time. And so one of the things you guys are gonna have to recognize is that the transformation work at some point has to come to an end, but the organization has to continue to adapt and transform. So what we found in a lot of places that we work is that people want to call the transformation done. And so having this idea of there's a system of delivery, which is basically the work of the company, and then having a system of continuous improvement is really work on the company. So it's kind of an in the business, on the business dichotomy. You can start to think about the ATO collapsing into the system of continuous improvement and basically having this duality of being able to have the part of the organization that's actually doing the work, and then there's part of the organization that continuously acts on the work that's being done and adapts the system as needs and market change. Okay, cool. So I think I got a few minutes.
Yep, exactly 5 minutes.
5 minutes. I saved 5 minutes for questions. That was a miracle. The
I
miracle.
know we had some in the chat. So Albert, did you want to read some of the questions that we have in the chat?
Yeah, these are no softball questions, Mike. So
I don't expect softball questions with this topic. It's all good.
one of the questions, one of the very first questions was, can you give some examples of leading indicators versus lagging indicators?
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? So here's one of the problems. This is like a classic problem. So we have to have the ability to get input from clients and be able to respond to changing market conditions, right? So we have to be able to manage change in our market, something like that. And there's probably 1,000 different ways we can measure that. So we have to ask ourselves, what conditions must be true in the organization in order to be able to do that? We also have to have complete cross-functional teams. I have to have those teams operating off of backlogs that are actually functional backlogs. I have to have the ability to produce a working tested increment of software. At the next level up, we have to have some sort of lean Kanban-based flow system, so features and epics move through the system, and feed the Scrum teams or user stories, right? Really tactical nuts and bolts kinds of things. So the work associated with just the slog of moving the organization from place to place is like, I might want to have the ability to have a team that can operate off of a backlog and establish a stable velocity. That might be a leading indicator of that. And then I know that I might want to be able to plan a predictable quarterly release. I might want the ability to pivot that backlog release to release and actually put something in market every quarter. Okay, so the leading indicators would be the performance of the team, the flexibility of the backlog, the ability to do quarterly planning, the ability to make strategic shifts, because we know that those things are preconditions for being able to actually engage our customer and be able to put things in front of them so that they'll be able to give us feedback down the road. right? So that's like one example. Again, like there can be zillions of them, but part of the art and the science of this is trying to figure out what things the organization cares about and how we're going to prove to them that we are making the right kinds of progress. So that there's another thing that we do is that it's probably even more detailed than that, is we have a fairly detailed assessment model that we use where the teams and the coaches can go in and evaluate themselves. So sometimes it's like velocity, sometimes it's the ability of teams to do certain things. It can be different defect metrics, just again, there's 1,000 things, but that's the kind of thing that we're talking about.